So we're just going to do the second question now, which is, what's required to complete a sufficient kind of kettlebell swing. And there are a few things, and I kind of want to talk about some things that I've learned over the course, obviously, which is great, but also some things that I've learned over my past 3 years experience as a PT in doing lots of kettlebell swings, or my clients anyway. So obviously a prerequisite to the kettlebell swing is a hip hinge, and if you can't hit hip hinge, you won't be able to complete this swing sufficiently. And what happens if the hip hinge is struggling is that the client will generally squat a little too low, which means the kettlebell's too low, and it's really hard to create that momentum when you drop your knees instead of shooting your hips backwards into a hip hinge. The second one is that sometimes a lot of people, and I get the same, I even in the first video for this assessment where I was trying to complete a kettlebell swing myself, I can sometimes fall into that trap of probably under swinging, so like a shallow hinge. And this is basically, I've got really tight hamstrings, so that doesn't obviously help. So what happens then is the butt doesn't matter, the hinge doesn't go back further enough, which means it's really shallow and you don't generate enough momentum. So you've kind of got to, by hiking your hands up, and maybe even, you could probably see in a little bit of mine, there was a little bit of an arch back involved as well, which means I'm probably not using my glutes enough and probably using too much of my back. And that's what happens when you have that really slow, really shallow hinge. So that's obviously the prerequisite is the kettlebell swing, and there's obviously a few techniques which is in the next couple of questions that I'll go through. But some other things that to keep in mind is a neutral spine. A couple of the issues I find, like I said, is that if there's a shallow swing, a bit of an arch in the back to try and create a little bit more momentum. Another one is the top of the back around it. And in my experience, this can happen not only if you can't hip hinge, and there's people that are trying a kettlebell swing before they're ready, but also people who can hip hinge but just have a really bad rounded posture, which is like kyphotic, which is like 90% of the people that we see. So what I'd try and do to get them to keep that neutral spine and that at the back, that straight spine, is to actually just squeeze the shoulder blades while they're doing the exercise, which will obviously turn your traps on and everything like that, keeping everything nice and aligned and nice and back. Your stance, obviously slightly wider than shoulder width, but again, in my experience, this is very dependent on the client and what they're comfortable with. Like I have a much wider stance. I have a bit of a sumo stance because that's just what I'm comfortable doing during a kettlebell swing. But other people will be a little bit narrow, a bit more like a Romanian kind of style. It's obviously got to be a little bit wider to allow that kettlebell room to get through your legs. I understand that, but there are people that there's outliers, whether it be a little bit wider or a little bit narrow. As long as the kettlebell can get through the legs and the knees are tracking over the toes, and everything else is in a line, it's not really, I don't think the stance is too much of an issue in my experience. I could be wrong. You could fail me. So obviously the next thing is we want to generate the momentum from the hips, which again is going back to that hip hinge. And to do that, obviously the hip hinge comes first, and then on the way out we breathe out and we squeeze our glutes, turn our abdomen on to really generate that power through the swing to get it up around eye level without using your arms too much. Another one is and I think you went through this in your course, is the hip hinge happening too early compared to the end of the swing. So what happens then is there's all this force that is generated on the lower back. And again, I think I may have done it in my video as well, where my hips on one of the reps definitely shot too early, stopped before the momentum of the kettlebell swing had reached the bottom of the swing between my legs. So what I like to try and make sure is that the hip hinge should be ending simultaneously with the end of the swing at the bottom. So to the point at which it's the furthest the kettlebell travels back between the legs is the point where you should be stopping your hip hinge. It should be simultaneous with that, with the end of the down phase. And obviously a bit of breathing, inhale on the way down, exhale on the way up. pretty simple stuff that we do in a lot of lifts. There are a few, there are a few different lifts that require different breathing, but this is another one where it's definitely the inhale on the way down, exhale on the way up.